News of the Times. The shocking murder of Harriet Farmer, bound and gagged in her East London shop. Welcome to News of the Times. In 1904, Harriet Farmer opened her East London newsagent shop as usual. 1 hour later, she was found bound, gagged and dying in the bedroom above. Who killed this eccentric shopkeeper, and why? There was no forced entry, no one heard screams, and yet Harriet's death sent ripples through Commercial Road. Rumours swirled of hidden money, suspicious visitors, and a reclusive woman who trusted no one. In today's episode, we revisit a chilling case from the heart of Edwardian London. A murder hiding in plain sight, and a killer who vanished without a trace. And in today's end of episode further particular story, we turn from one Victorian tragedy to another. This one involving a honeymoon, a Pullman carriage, and a groom whose marital bliss derailed somewhere near Derby. Fasten your seatbelts and possibly your bridegroom. Adjust your cravat and secure your corset, optional, and recline in your least rickety armchair. For today's tale features East End villainy, whispered gossip, and a most inconvenient corpse discovered before the morning tea had cooled. Harriet Emily Farmer, a fiercely independent shopkeeper with hidden flair. Harriet Farmer, occasionally referred to as Emily in later reports, was a familiar figure along the Commercial Road in London's East End. Unmarried and in her late 50s, she lived alone in the rooms above her newspaper and stationery shop at number 478, a business long held by the Farmer family. After the deaths of her parents and later her brother, Harriet chose solitude over security. She ran the shop herself, opened it each morning without fail, and managed deliveries with the help of a local errand boy. Neighbours described her as eccentric, self-contained, proud, and resistant to offers of help. Even when unwell, she would tolerate only the barest intrusion. But there was another side to Harriet. Though she kept no close company, reports suggest she enjoyed dressing up in the evenings, wearing silks, fine scarves, and bits of jewellery. One might imagine her upstairs, above the clatter of the East End, transforming her small parlour into something gentler, finer. A brief escape from the routine of early mornings and cautious glances through the shop window. She was, it seems, a woman of ritual and imagination, guarding her independence with as much care as she may have guarded her rumoured savings. Local whispers suggest she had as much as £1,000 hidden somewhere in the shop, although this may well have been exaggerated by gossip and speculation. Neighbours such as Mrs. Baker next door kept a quiet eye on her, particularly when unfamiliar men were seen in the shop, but Harriet refused to live in fear or with company. It would be her undoing. From the Globe, the 12th of October 1904, daring murder in the East End, shopkeeper bound and suffocated. A great sensation was caused in Commercial Road today by the tragic death of a woman named Harriet Farmer, who for some years past had carried on business at 478 Commercial Road as a newsagent. The circumstances of her death are such as to indicate that she was the victim of a murderous outrage. The deceased, who was unmarried and between 50 and 60 years of age, lived alone over her shop. She opened the shop as usual. This morning she opened the shop usual between 7 and 8 o'clock and gave her errand boy the morning papers for his usual round. After the boy had delivered the papers, he returned to the shop just after 8 o'clock and could not find his employer. He searched the shop and the back room and then communicated with the neighbours next door, a confectioner and his wife named Baker. Mrs. Baker sent for a constable in consequence of finding that only half the shutters of the shop had been taken down and that the shop itself was in a state of disorder. Apparently, from the condition of the shop, Miss Farmer had started to prepare it for the day and had been interrupted in her work. Still breathing. The police constable, accompanied by Mrs. Baker, went upstairs and found Miss Farmer lying face downwards on a bed with her hands tied behind her. They at once cut the string and, turning Miss Farmer over, found that some rags had been stuffed into her mouth. These were removed. Miss Farmer was still breathing, but within a couple of minutes she expired. An examination of her throat showed that there were some marks which might have been caused by a person's hand, but upon the arrival of the doctor it was ascertained that death was due to suffocation caused by the rags being placed in the mouth. It is thought from the disorderly state of the shop that Miss Farmer must have been attacked there, for lying on the floor were her false teeth and one half of her spectacles. The other half of her spectacles were found on the stairs, which leads to the opinion that she must have been trying to get away from her assailant by making her way to her bedroom. It was subsequently discovered, however, that a box in which Miss Farmer was in the habit of keeping her money was lying empty in the back room. Inquiries made. From inquiries made later, it appeared that the shop in which the outrage occurred was formerly kept by Mr. James Farmer, father of the deceased, and had been in the family for over 20 years. After the deaths of Mr. Farmer and his wife, the shop was kept on by Miss Farmer and her brother. The brother, however, died 3 or 4 years ago, and since then Miss Farmer has lived entirely alone. She was said to be eccentric. Several times neighbours suggested to her that she should have somebody in the house with her, but she absolutely refused, and even when she was ill a short time ago, there was considerable difficulty in persuading her to allow anyone to look after her. It was gossip in the district that Miss Farmer was worth a considerable sum of money and kept about £1,000 in the house. Several times during the past few weeks, suspicious persons have entered the shop, and on more than one occasion Mrs. Baker, in consequence of this, made it her business to see Miss Farmer while these persons were there. The thoroughfare is a busy one, and inquiries made show that no one saw any suspicious persons enter the shop between 7 and 8 o'clock, nor did they hear the sound of struggling or of screams. Another account states that the towel had been forced into Miss Farmer's mouth and under the nostrils, and it was held in position by a band of calico which had been tied at the back of the head. It was drawn very tightly across the mouth. The police are making the closest investigations. The inquest into her death. At the opening of the inquest held that Thursday, Miss Farmer's 2 brothers, both men of respectable standing, confirmed what many in the neighbourhood already suspected. Their sister was a woman of private habits and a sharp independence. Eccentric, yes, but not unkind. She simply preferred her own company and kept the world at arm's length. But it was soon revealed this wasn't the first time Harriet had been targeted. Only months earlier, in May, she had been violently assaulted inside her own shop. A man had struck her across the head with a handbag, one cruelly filled with stones. Just as he appeared ready to rob her, he was interrupted only by the sudden arrival of a customer and fled before he could carry out whatever he had planned. Now, in her death, the coroner confirmed the worst. Harriet had been gagged so tightly that she suffocated. Her death was not accidental. It was calculated, silent, deliberate. And still, no one had seen a thing. The inquest was adjourned, but the questions only deepened. From the Manchester Courier and Lancashire Advertiser, the 15th of October 1904, ghastly tragedy, woman bound, gagged and suffocated. She foretold her fate. One of the most terrible crimes which has been recorded in London for many years occurred in the East End on Wednesday morning, when an old lady was gagged, bound and choked to death in her own shop in broad daylight. In a small newspaper and tobacconist shop on Commercial Road in Limehouse, there has lived for many years a lady named Miss Farmer, aged about 56. The business had been carried on by members of Miss Farmer's family for upwards of 50 years, and when her brother, Mr. James Farmer, died some 7 years ago, she retained the shop and lived alone in a couple of rooms overhead. In accordance with her usual custom, she closed the premises and retired to rest at 10:30 on Tuesday night, having a few minutes before bidden good night to her neighbour, Mrs. Priscilla Baker, who conducts a confectionery establishment next door. No one was seen of her until 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, when she opened her front door and supplied a few waiting newsboys with the morning papers. At this hour, Commercial Road is exceedingly quiet, and it's not surprising that, although the shop door remained open, it was not noticed that there was any sign of life within. How the discovery was made. On the errand boy's arrival, not finding Miss Farmer in the shop, he gathered the papers strewn about, sold 4 papers to customers, and, after calling his mistress and getting no answer, went in next door. Mrs. Baker then made a hasty examination of her neighbour's shop, and noticing that the place was disarranged and finding no trace of her friend, she went in search of a policeman. And with a constable, the house was searched, and in the front bedroom the officer came across the body of the unfortunate woman. A terrible scene. Describing the terrible scene that met their gaze, Mrs. Baker said she was lying face downward on the bed, her head hanging over the edge and almost touching the floor. I saw at a glance that she was gagged and bound. Her thin hands were tied tightly behind her, her ankles were bound with strong twine, and round her mouth was a piece of cloth tightly tied. This we at once tore away and found that her mouth was stuffed with a piece of cloth. This piece of cloth was soaked in blood, and when it was removed, blood flowed onto the floor. We cut the cords that bound her, laid her on the bed, and tore open her dress, and I felt that her heart was just beating. While I remained with the poor woman, the constable sent for 2 doctors. They came almost immediately, but they were too late to do anything. The poor woman died almost as they reached the shop. The victim's arms were swollen 4 times their natural size. A set of false teeth were found near the counter in the shop, and upstairs broken pince-nez were found. House in disorder. In all parts of the room there were papers and documents which had evidently been hurriedly thrown from a drawer. The furniture was upset, and everything pointed to the theory that the woman had been attacked by thieves. The police were quickly on the scene, and under the direction of Detective Inspector Deval, a search was made for a clue to the perpetrators of the crime. Nothing, however, was found. Later in the morning, the body was removed to the mortuary to await the inquest. Then, the excited crowd which had lingered around the shop all the morning dispersed, and the premises were placed in charge of police constables. Reputed miser's hoard. It is evidently a case in which the existence of a reputed miner's hoard attracted a desperate ruffian ready to sacrifice life in the search for gold. Miss Farmer had recently told Mrs. Baker that she intended to retire from business, and from her general manner Miss Baker believed she had managed to save a considerable sum. "I don't know where she kept it," Mrs. Baker remarked, "but I believe there was a good deal in her bedroom." This statement is important, as the police, in spite of a vigorous search, were only able to find 4 pence. The medical view is that the woman's assailant did not intend to take her life, but sought to stifle her cries, and that she died from suffocation owing to the long time she was left lying before discovery. Miss Farmer was rather eccentric and reserved. She would remain untidy in appearance, it is said, till late in the afternoon, and then, whether she was going out or not, she would attire herself in the most elaborate silk dress, which seemed to be her only pride. Twice before attacked. It's a singular fact that twice before Miss Farmer had been attacked. About 3 years ago she was attacked by some boys with sandbags, and she was seriously hurt. Since that date she was attacked while standing behind her shop counter by a man who tried to rush the till. She prevented him from getting all the money, but he cleared out with some of it, leaving her bruised and shaken. In spite of this, she never would listen to those of her acquaintances who advised her to have somebody in the house. What makes this tragedy all the more chilling is the silence that surrounded it. Miss Farmer's shop stood in the heart of a bustling block, neighbours on either side, footsteps constant outside, and yet no one heard a thing. Mr. Magnus, the grocer next door, reported no cries, no struggle, not even the faintest thud. Miss Baker, just feet away through the shared wall, heard nothing to warn her of the horror unfolding upstairs. Even Harry Wiggins, the young errand boy who first raised the alarm, saw no suspicious figure slipping away in the morning. It is a case that captures one of the darkest truths of Edwardian London, that a murder could occur in utter silence, hidden not by shadows, but by the vast impersonal thrum of the city itself. The police theory. The police have reconstructed the murder with great detail. The men who did it were no doubt fully aware of the old lady's reputed wealth, and were equally aware of the fact that she lived alone and was thus an easy prey. It is pretty clear, too, that the murder was not their object. The theory is that 2 men entered the shop, closed the door behind them, seized the old lady, and immediately gagged her. Then, without fear of interruption and the appearance of early customers, they carried their victim upstairs, bound her, and laid her across the bed. Then they ransacked the place, flinging the contents of the room about in their haste to discover the hidden treasure. At this time the poor victim was struggling on the bed, and so they left her. What they found nobody knows, for the secret of the lady's wealth, if there was any wealth, died with her. It is understood that the police found nothing in their search of the place afterwards. Only slender clues. The house was in a wretchedly dirty state, with dust and grime everywhere. The dust was some help to the police, for in one or two places they found fingerprints which may assist them in their hunt for the assassins. Several clues were reported to have been Wednesday afternoon, but at present these are vague and unpromising. The most substantial is that which comes from a boy who saw a man run out of Miss Farmer's shop at about 6:30 on the morning and board an Aldgate tram. He was dark, medium height, and carried a brown paper parcel under his arm. Despite the initial confusion and lack of evidence, police wasted no time. Detectives combed through the East End for leads, scouring witness lists and retracing every step taken on that quiet Wednesday morning. But it was not a seasoned inspector who cracked the case. It was a boy. Young Robert Ray, a fish carrier from Church Road, claimed to have seen something extraordinary. Two men leaving Miss Farmer's shop just after dawn. His sharp eyes and steady memory would soon change everything. Two men arrested, watched by a boy. The police have arrested two men, Conrad Donovan, a sailor, and Charles Wade, labourer, who are charged. They were brought up at the Thames Police Court on Monday. The only evidence tendered was that of a boy named Robert Ray, a fish carrier of Church Road, whose description of the men led to their arrest. He stated that he had known Donovan and Wade for some time past. One of them, Donovan, lived 2 doors away from him. Just before 6:30 on Wednesday, the morning of the murder, he was standing in Commercial Road and saw Wade coming out of Miss Farmer's shop, Donovan following immediately behind. Both men were carrying newspapers in their hands. He watched them stop in the middle of the road, look at the paper, and then resumed their walk when outside Stephanie Temple, Bromley Street. Then they walked towards Poplar and added, "Ray, I saw nothing more of them." Ray waited outside the shop a little longer and saw Miss Farmer's newspaper boy take down the shutters. Nobody else entered the shop. He said in reply to the magistrate after the men had left. After he had told his mother what he had seen, he heard of the murder and on Friday made a statement to Detective Inspector Deval, who subsequently effected the arrest. The prisoners were then identified out of 14 others by Ray. The men were remanded. Bridge. The trial. The trial of Donovan and Wade drew both fascination and frustration. No one had seen the murder committed. There were no bloodied weapons, no stolen goods found, no confessions whispered in darkened cells. What the prosecution did have was circumstantial but compelling. At the heart of the case was young Robert Ray, the fish boy, whose early morning observations put the two men at the scene. His testimony never wavered. The men he identified were not strangers to the area, nor the police. Donovan's long record of violence and theft, coupled with Wade's freshly served sentence, helped to reinforce Ray's account. And when a new witness stepped forward admitting he had kept silence out of the fear of his own safety, the fragile puzzle began to lock into place. Against a backdrop of doubt, danger, and East End suspicion, the trial unfolded, with everything riding on whether the jury would find these scattered fragments enough to send two men to the gallows. From the Wolverton Express, the 25th of November 1904. Stepney murderers to hang. The trial has been concluded after 3 days' hearing at the Central Criminal Court of Conrad Donovan, a sailor, and Charles Wade, a labourer, charged with the murder of Miss Emily Farmer, a newsagent, at her shop in Commercial Road on October the 12th. Evidence similar to that given at the police court and inquest was given for the prosecution, and a new witness was called who spoke to seeing the accused in the neighbourhood of the deceased shop late on the night preceding the murder and again early on the following morning when the crime was discovered. The witness declared that he had not come forward before because it was a rough neighbourhood and he and his parents were afraid of being attacked if he offered to give evidence. Mr. Hughes for the defence said that he be called no witness. Mr. Matthews, in summing up the evidence to the jury, said he thought there would be little doubt that the object of the murder was robbery. It was for the jury to say whether the prosecution had not brought the crime home to the prisoners beyond the possibility of doubt. If there was a solid and substantial doubt in the case, by all means let the jury give the prisoners the benefit of it. Mr. Hughes, addressing the jury for the defence, suggested that the evidence was not nearly sufficiently strong to justify the prisoners being indicted for the most trivial case of robbery. This was not a case in which it was the desire of the prosecution that there should be blood for blood. His defence to the charge was not one which had been evolved for the prisoners by way of excuse, but it was a defence forced upon him by the inherent unreliability of the evidence for the prosecution. More than one of the witnesses for the prosecution had declared that the deceased woman was alive when her body was discovered, but the weakness and the helplessness of the prosecution was shown, Mr. Matthews having to resort to the unheard of expedient of demolishing the evidence of his own witnesses before he could build up his case against the accused men. In summing up, Mr. Justice Grantham commented on the fact that the prisoners had not entered the witness box to account for their whereabouts on the morning of the murder, and said that the quality, not the quantity, of the evidence of identification was what the jury had to consider. The jury, after deliberating 10 minutes, found the prisoners guilty of wilful murder. Mr. Justice Grantham, in sentencing them to death, said the jury had found both prisoners guilty and no one who had heard the evidence could have come to any other conclusion than that. As to Donovan, he was not surprised, knowing, as he did, something of his life. He found that in 1896 he was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment for striking his superior officer, and in 1898 he was sentenced to 3 years' penal servitude for housebreaking. Since then he had been several times convicted, and, that being his past life, it showed that he was a man who went about preying upon others. As to Wade, although he was much younger, he had been involved in crime, having come out of prison only recently, as October last. The prisoners were then sentenced to death in the usual form. Someone in the public gallery shouted, "Cheer up, Johnny," and waved a hand. Donovan, who was leaving the dock, looked up and nodded in recognition of the remark. Wade, who had turned also to leave, suddenly wheeled round and, advancing to the front of the block, looking towards the bench and counsel for the prosecution, said, I'd settle you in 2 woods if I had a chance." He was at once seized by the warders and removed from the dock. The execution. Until the very end, both men maintained their innocence, but behind the prison walls cracks began to show. Donovan, the elder of the two, appeared deeply remorseful, telling the prison chaplain that murder had never been the intent. His half-brother, Wade, by contrast, faced the scaffold with stoic defiance, showing no sign of regret. There would be no dramatic last-minute reprieve, no crowds crying out for mercy. In a city often quick to romanticize even its darkest criminals, public sympathy for the brothers was conspicuously absent. The crime had been callous, the evidence, while circumstantial, was damning, and the sentence, when carried out that cold December morning at Pentonville, passed with quiet finality, a brutal end to a brutal crime. From the Western Gazette, the 16th of December, 1904, the death penalty. 2 men hung at Pentonville. At Pentonville on Tuesday morning, Conrad Donovan, 34, sailor, and Charles Wade, 22, labourer, half-brothers, were executed for the murder of Emily Farmer, 60, newsagent from Stepney. The condemned men passed rather a restless night, and Tuesday morning left their breakfast untouched. Wade appeared to be quite indifferent to his fate, but Donovan seemed very penitent. The latter told the chaplain that murder was never intended. Death was instantaneous. Burlington, assisted by Pierpont, was the executioner. Further particulars. From the grim tale of a woman bound and gagged above her East End newsagents, we now move to something far more unhinged: matrimony. Our next story features a brand new bride, a Pullman carriage, and a groom who, well, let's just say he didn't take well to being married. Victorian romance, as always, proves to be a dangerous sport. From the Flintshire Observer, the 12th of April, 1894. Seen in a Pullman car, a bridegroom gone mad. There was an extraordinary and alarming scene on the 9th in the saloon of a Pullman car in the express train which left Derby at 5 minutes to 12 and arrived at St Pancras shortly before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Among the passengers was a gentleman, apparently past middle age, who, soon after the train started on its journey, broke into a paroxysm of madness, raving loudly, gesticulating with violence, and knocking chairs and tables about in a reckless fashion. With one exception, the ladies, who were naturally frightened by the man's behaviour, fled to the smoking division and begged the protection of the gentlemen who were there enjoying a smoke after luncheon. Upon inquiry, it was found that the one trembling lady who remained on guard over the apparent lunatic was the gentleman's wife, and that, moreover, they were on their honeymoon trip, having been married the same morning in one of the smaller Derbyshire towns, not far from Derby. The terrified bride stated that she had not been acquainted with him many months before the wedding, and she did not believe he had been drinking, and that the fit of madness had come upon him suddenly in the train. It was at first proposed that the violent passenger should be required to leave the train at Luton or Bedford, but upon ascertaining that the man's brother had arranged to meet the newly married pair on the arrival of the train at St Pancras, the gentlemen passengers agreed, with the aid of the railway inspector, to take charge of him until the train reached London. At St Pancras, another extraordinary scene occurred, and it was with difficulty that the astonished brother-in-waiting could get the unfortunate bridegroom under control. Another account says, in the dining car, a rough-looking man, respectably dressed, was found struggling in the grasp of 2 or 3 gentlemen and uttering imprecations of the most violent kind. It transpired that the man, who was from Matlock Bridge, had only been married the same morning, and that he and his bridegroom were on their way to St Pancras where a brother was to meet them for the honeymoon. The next station, some distance ahead, was Luton, and it was proposed by the ladies that the man should be put out there. But Sir Thomas Roe pointed to the manifest inhumanity of having the bride with the mad husband and then in an out of the way place. And he proposed that the ladies, including the young wife, should instead be transferred to another carriage. This was done at Luton, and, with assistance obtained there, the man was kept within bounds until London was reached, Sir Thomas Roe and his nephews rendering assistance when needed. At St Pancras, the man was met by his brother, and the state of the case having been made known to the police, he was taken to a place of safe custody. The tale hath been told, the mystery laid bare, and the final words spoken. If satisfaction hath eluded thee, direct thy grumbles to the scriptwriter, although take heed, for she has vanished once more, leaving behind only quills, biscuit crumbs, and a half-written resignation letter pinned to a stuffed owl. But for those of stout heart and a sharper mind who found delight and dark intrigue, hear this. Like, subscribe and share. Spread these tidings far and wide to kin, companions, and that suspicious figure who lurks every Tuesday by the baker's cart. For in so doing thou shalt appease the great and unfathomable YouTube algorithm, and ensure that further tales of villainy, virtue, and vexation may yet grace thine ears. Supporters of villainy, virtue, and vexation, this is thy summons. Join us on Patreon and enjoy a full week of access entirely free. No trickery, no peculiar clauses, no spontaneous appearances by a Victorian solicitor demanding twopence. You'll get ad-free episodes, early access, exclusive extras, and the moral satisfaction of supporting a lone historian with very strong feelings about fonts and murder. Your £5 a month keeps the research flowing, the tea hot, and the scriptwriter marginally less feral. Get thee to patreon.com/News of the Times Historical Crime. Unlock the archive, support the show, confound the algorithm, and become part of the mystery, one crime at a time. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, charter member of the League of Startled Gentlemen, emerging from the fog dramatically.